The interstate stretched out in front of them like an endless ribbon of black, the faded white lines hypnotically vanishing under the glow of the headlights. Jake had been driving for hours, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Beside him, Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, staring out into the night. The darkness seemed impenetrable, save for the occasional distant glow of another car's taillights or a flicker of light from a desolate gas station. "We should stop soon," Sarah murmured, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "This road is giving me the creeps." Jake glanced at her, his lips twitching into a tight smile. "I just want to make it another hour. The map says there's a motel up ahead." Sarah didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on something outside the window. Jake followed her line of sight but saw only darkness. Just as he was about to ask her what was wrong, she shivered and turned away. "I thought I saw someone on the side of the road," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake laughed nervously. "Probably just your imagination. There's nothing out here but empty highway." But Sarah didn't look convinced. She tightened her arms around herself, her fingers digging into her elbows. Jake tried to push the unease away, focusing on the road ahead. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the sensation that they weren't alone. It started as a flicker in the rearview mirror. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing larger and brighter with alarming speed. Jake frowned, watching as the vehicle closed the gap between them. The car, a battered, rusted pickup, swerved erratically as it sped closer, its headlights casting jagged shadows across the empty highway. "What the hell is that guy doing?" Jake muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. The truck roared up behind them, tailgating dangerously close. Jake tapped the brakes lightly, hoping to signal the driver to back off, but the truck responded by flashing its high beams, flooding the car with blinding light. Sarah yelped, shielding her eyes. "Just let him pass," she urged, panic creeping into her voice. Jake slowed down, pulling toward the shoulder, but instead of overtaking them, the truck swerved violently and rammed into their rear bumper. The impact jolted them forward, and Sarah screamed. "Is this guy insane?" Jake shouted, slamming his foot on the gas. The car surged forward, but the truck stayed on their tail, its engine growling like a predator closing in on its prey. The chase continued for what felt like an eternity, the truck ramming them again and again. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he fought to keep control of the car. The road ahead twisted sharply, and he veered into the turn, tires screeching. For a moment, the truck fell back, its headlights disappearing into the distance. Jake and Sarah barely had time to catch their breath before they saw it again, parked in the middle of the road ahead. Its headlights were off, but as they approached, they flicked on, blinding them once more. "Jake, stop!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. Jake swerved violently to avoid the truck, the car skidding off the road and into a ditch. The impact was brutal, and for a moment, everything went dark. When Jake came to, his head throbbed, and the taste of blood filled his mouth. Sarah was slumped against the window, unconscious but breathing. He tried to move, but his leg was pinned. The faint sound of gravel crunching under boots reached his ears, growing louder with each step. Jake turned his head slowly, dread twisting in his gut. A figure loomed in the darkness, silhouetted by the truck's headlights. The man was tall, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. In his hand, he held something long and metallic, gleaming in the light. Jake's breaths came in shallow gasps as the man approached, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The stranger stopped just outside the driver's side window, peering in at Jake with a crooked smile that sent chills down his spine. "Looks like you had a little accident," the man drawled, his voice low and menacing. Jake tried to speak, to plead, but his throat felt frozen. The man raised the metal object, a crowbar, and brought it down hard on the window. Glass shattered, spraying across Jake's face. He twisted away, his hands fumbling for anything he could use as a weapon. The man reached through the broken window, his hand closing around Jake's collar. Before he could pull him out, Sarah let out a guttural scream, her hands clawing at the stranger's arm. He turned, momentarily distracted, and Jake seized the opportunity. He grabbed a shard of glass and drove it into the man's arm. The man howled in pain, stumbling back. Jake didn't wait to see what he'd do next. He reached over, shaking Sarah awake. "We have to go now." With adrenaline surging through them, they scrambled out of the car. Sarah leaned heavily on Jake as they stumbled toward the trees lining the highway. The truck's engine roared to life behind them, its headlights sweeping across the ditch as it turned to follow. Jake and Sarah ran deeper into the woods, branches slapping at their faces and tearing at their clothes. The truck couldn't follow, but the man could. They could hear his heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, accompanied by the sound of labored breathing. They didn't stop until they reached a clearing, their lungs burning and their legs threatening to give out. Jake looked around, trying to find anything they could use for shelter. The clearing was empty, except for an old rusted signpost leaning at an angle. The faded letters read, "Dead End Road." A chilling laugh echoed through the trees, sending shivers down their spines. The man's silhouette appeared at the edge of the clearing, his crowbar glinting in the moonlight. Jake stepped in front of Sarah, fists clenched, ready to fight. The man took a step forward, then another, his smile widening. But before he could reach them, the ground beneath him gave way with a sickening crack. He let out a startled yell as he disappeared into the darkness below. Jake and Sarah cautiously approached the hole, peering down. The man lay motionless at the bottom, his body twisted unnaturally. Jake's stomach churned, but relief flooded through him. It was over, or so he thought. As they turned to leave, a low groan echoed from the pit. The man's eyes snapped open, glowing faintly in the darkness. His lips curled into that same crooked smile as he began to climb. The road was a dark, unbroken void, stretching endlessly between sparse streetlights that cast long, menacing shadows. Tom had taken this route hundreds of times, but tonight it felt different, unnervingly quiet. His GPS had warned him about delays on the main highway, directing him to this unfamiliar back road instead. At first, it seemed like a blessing. No traffic, no stops. But the deeper he went, the more isolated it felt, and the nagging sense of unease crept in. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 1:13 a.m. The radio crackled faintly, static, interspersed with distorted snippets of voices that faded as quickly as they appeared. Tom reached to turn it off, but just as his hand brushed the knob, the headlights illuminated something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Tom slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt mere feet from the person. His heart pounded as he squinted through the windshield. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long, tattered coat. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his stance was rigid, unnatural. Tom rolled down the window slightly, his voice trembling. "Hey, you all right?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head at an odd angle, as if studying Tom. Unnerved, Tom decided to drive around him. As he turned the wheel, the man snapped upright and he raised an arm pointing directly at the car. Tom's stomach twisted, but he pressed the gas, swerving to avoid him. The car sped past, leaving the figure behind. Tom glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was gone. "Great," Tom muttered, trying to shake off the encounter. But the unease clung to him like a second skin. A few minutes later, the radio crackled again, louder this time, and a distorted voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Tom's hands tightened on the wheel. He turned off the radio entirely, the sudden silence almost deafening. The road seemed endless, the scenery outside monotonous and oppressive. Then, in the distance, he saw them, headlights. Another car, finally. Relieved, Tom slowed slightly as the vehicle approached. But as it drew closer, something felt off. The headlights were uneven, flickering unnaturally, and the car itself, an old, rusted sedan, lurched as if it were barely holding together. The other driver didn't dim their lights, the glare nearly blinding as they passed. For a split second, Tom thought he saw something in the passenger seat, a pale face staring at him, its eyes wide and empty. He jerked his gaze back to the road, heart hammering. The rearview mirror showed the car pulling a sharp U-turn, its headlights now following him. "No, no, no," Tom muttered, pressing harder on the gas. The sedan gained speed, its headlights growing larger, brighter. It was almost on top of him when it suddenly veered off, disappearing into the woods. Tom's relief was short-lived. Up ahead, the same sedan sat in the middle of the road, its engine idling. Tom slammed the brakes again, skidding to a stop. His breath came in short, panicked bursts as he scanned the area. No one was inside the car. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Tom snatched it up, grateful for the distraction, but the screen displayed an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Hello?" His voice cracked. A low, guttural breathing filled the line, followed by a voice barely human. "Look behind you." Tom's body froze, his blood turning to ice. Slowly, he turned his head. The man from earlier stood inches from the driver's side window, his face now visible, a grotesque mask of hollow eyes and a too-wide grin, his skin pale and cracked like old porcelain. Tom screamed, slamming the car into reverse. The tires spun, struggling for traction before the car shot backward. The figure didn't move, but seemed to vanish, as if melting into the darkness. Tom spun the car around, desperate to escape, his pulse thundering in his ears. The road twisted and turned, the trees closing in like skeletal fingers. Tom didn't dare slow down. But no matter how far he drove, the headlights of that cursed sedan appeared in his mirrors, closer each time he looked. Finally, he spotted a gas station up ahead, its flickering neon sign a beacon of hope. He pulled in, skidding to a stop by the pumps. The station was eerily quiet, but the bright lights offered a semblance of safety. Tom stumbled out of the car, his knees weak. "Help!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the lot. Some man emerged from the station, a wiry attendant with a weary expression. Tom pointed toward the road. There's someone following me. A car. It's been chasing me for miles." The attendant frowned, glancing at the empty road. "Haven't seen a single car all night. You sure you're not imagining things?" Tom shook his head vehemently. "No, I saw it. It was real. A rusted sedan and a man." The attendant's face darkened. "Rusted sedan, you say?" Tom nodded, desperate for him to understand. The attendant's expression grew grim. "That car's been haunting this stretch of road for years. People say it belongs to a man who died in a wreck out here, trying to run someone off the road. They never found his body, just the car. Folks who see it, well, they don't usually make it out alive." Tom's stomach churned, dread pooling in his gut. He turned back toward his car, the shadows around it seeming deeper, more menacing. The headlights of the sedan flickered to life at the edge of the lot, its engine roaring. The attendant backed away, his face pale. "You need to go. Now." Before Tom could respond, the sedan hurtled toward him. He dove out of the way, the vehicle screeching to a halt inches from his car. The driver's side door creaked open, and the man stepped out, his grin stretching impossibly wide. Tom scrambled to his feet, but it was too late. The man raised a hand, his fingers unnaturally long, and pointed at Tom. The last thing he saw was the blinding glare of the headlights before everything went dark. When morning came, the gas station was empty. Tom's car sat abandoned, the keys still in the ignition. The only sign of him was a single set of footprints leading into the woods, footprints that stopped abruptly as if swallowed by the earth. The highway stretched out like a black ribbon under the pale light of the moon. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. She'd been driving for hours, heading to a distant family gathering she wasn't particularly thrilled about. The GPS had directed her to a detour, a shortcut it claimed, but the deserted, narrow road felt anything but. The occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the hum of her car were the only sounds breaking the eerie silence. She hadn't passed another vehicle in what felt like an eternity. A sense of unease crept over her, but she told herself it was just her imagination. She was tired, that was all. Then she saw it, a faint figure standing on the side of the road. At first, it looked like a trick of the shadows, but as she got closer, she realized it was a man. He was dressed in ragged clothes, his head bowed, arms limp at his sides. His posture was unsettling, unnaturally still, as though he were carved from stone. Sarah's stomach twisted. She pressed her foot on the accelerator, deciding not to stop. As her car passed him, the man's head snapped up, and for a split second his face was illuminated by her headlights. It was gaunt and hollow, his eyes dark pits that seemed to bore into her. She let out a gasp and sped away, her heart pounding. Minutes passed, but her pulse refused to settle. She glanced at her rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness stretched behind her. Relieved, she took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on the road ahead. The relief was short-lived. A shadow darted across the road, and Sarah slammed on the brakes. Her car screeched to a halt, tires skidding on the asphalt. The figure from before was standing in the middle of the road now, staring directly at her, his head tilted unnaturally to the side. Fear surged through her. She threw the car into reverse, but the engine sputtered and stalled. No, 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 she muttered, twisting the key in the ignition. The car refused to start. The figure began to move, not walking, but gliding toward her. His feet didn't seem to touch the ground. Sarah locked the doors, her breaths coming in short gasps. She fumbled for her phone, her shaking hands struggling to dial 911. Before she could press the call button, the man was there, inches from her window. He raised a hand, his fingers splayed against the glass. His mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear. Then, with a jarring crack, the window began to frost over from his touch, the ice spreading in jagged lines. Sarah screamed, ducking low in her seat. She tried the ignition again, and this time the car roared to life. Without hesitation, she floored the gas, the vehicle lurching forward. She heard a sickening thud as the car passed through the figure, but when she glanced in the rearview mirror, there was nothing there. Her hands trembled on the wheel as she drove, her eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. The frost on the window was gone, but the unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Ahead, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Relief flooded her. Another car, finally. She flicked her high beams to signal them, hoping they might stop. As the vehicle drew closer, her stomach dropped. It was an old, battered truck, its lights flickering erratically. The truck slowed as it neared her, pulling up alongside her car. Sarah glanced at the driver. A man in a wide-brimmed hat sat behind the wheel, his face shadowed. But what chilled her to the bone was the passenger, a pale figure with dark, hollow eyes staring straight at her. Her scream echoed inside the car as she swerved, losing control. The car spun off the road, crashing into a ditch. The impact was jarring, the airbags deploying with a deafening hiss. Dazed, Sarah struggled to unbuckle her seatbelt, her ears ringing. When she looked up, the truck was parked on the shoulder. The driver and the figure were standing outside now, their silhouettes illuminated by the truck's headlights. Slowly, they began to walk toward her. Sarah scrambled out of the car, her legs shaky. She stumbled into the woods, branches snagging at her clothes as she ran. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't dare look back. The woods seemed endless, the trees looming like silent sentinels. Finally, she tripped, falling hard onto the damp ground. She lay there, too terrified to move, listening for the sound of footsteps. Silence. She slowly raised her head, her eyes darting around. There was no sign of them. Maybe she'd lost them. But just as the thought crossed her mind, a low whisper brushed against her ear. "You can't run." Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice. She turned her head slowly, and there he was. The man with the hollow eyes, crouched beside her, his grin stretching impossibly wide. The last thing she saw was his hand reaching for her, the shadows swallowing them both. When morning came, a passing motorist found Sarah's car abandoned by the roadside. There was no sign of her, only a single word etched into the frosted window: "Run." The highway at night was a void, silent, endless, and suffocating. Mark hated long drives, especially alone, but he had no choice. His sister's emergency had forced him to make this midnight trek across the state. The air in his old sedan felt heavy, the hum of the engine the only companion to his growing unease. A green road sign flickered in the distance. Route 68, 10 miles. The GPS was glitching, recalculating every few minutes, so Mark had resorted to following the signs instead. The radio had given up hours ago, emitting only static, which he had turned off to save himself of the irritation. As the car's headlights sliced through the darkness, a shape appeared on the shoulder, a hitchhiker. Mark squinted. It was a woman in a tattered gray hoodie, her face obscured by shadows. She stood motionless, one arm raised with a thumb out. Mark gripped the wheel tighter. Picking her up didn't seem safe, but leaving her out here felt equally wrong. Against his better judgment, he slowed down and rolled down the passenger side window. "Need a ride?" he asked hesitantly. The woman didn't answer. She just stood there, her head tilting slightly, as if she were trying to understand him. Then, with deliberate slowness, she climbed into the car. Her movements were jerky, almost unnatural. Mark tried to force a smile. "Where you headed?" She turned her head toward him, her face hidden under the hood. "Just drive," she whispered, her voice raspy and brittle. Mark swallowed hard, but obeyed. The air inside the car seemed to grow colder, the hairs on his arms standing on end. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She sat stiffly, her hands clutching the edges of her seat, her hood still hiding her face. Minutes passed in tense silence. Mark tried to break it. "So, you live around here?" "No," she said flatly. Her voice sent a shiver down his spine, and he decided against further small talk. The road stretched on, winding through dense woods. Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror and his heart skipped a beat. For a split second, he thought he saw another figure in the back seat, a pale face staring at him from the shadows. He whipped his head around. The back seat was empty. "Something wrong?" the woman asked, her head tilting toward him. "No," Mark stammered, his knuckles tightening on the wheel. "Just tired." The woman didn't respond. Instead, she let out a low, guttural chuckle that didn't sound quite human. Mark's heart pounded as he focused on the road, desperate to put distance between him and whatever she was. Then, without warning, she spoke. "Do you know what happens on this road?" Mark hesitated. "No." "People disappear," she said, her voice growing softer, almost melodic. "They never find their way out." Mark tried to laugh it off. "Yeah, well, I plan to make it through just fine." The woman turned her head toward him, the hood falling back slightly. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, but it was her mouth that froze him. It was too wide, her grin stretching unnaturally across her face. "You won't," she whispered. Mark slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. He turned to face her, but the passenger seat was empty. His breathing quickened as he scanned the car. She was gone. Panicking, he hit the gas, speeding down the road. The GPS recalculated again, its robotic voice stuttering. Rerouting. Destination unavailable. Mark cursed and glanced at the screen. The map was blank, the little blue arrow spinning aimlessly. He threw the GPS aside and focused on the road, but it felt different now. The trees loomed closer, their branches clawing at the car like hands. Then the headlights illuminated something ahead. A figure stood in the middle of the road. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he recognized her, the same woman in the gray hoodie. But this time, her face was fully visible, her hollow eyes locked onto his. Mark swerved, trying to avoid her, but the car veered off the road, crashing into a ditch. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment, everything was silent. When he opened his eyes, she was standing beside the car, staring down at him through the shattered window. Her grin had widened impossibly, stretching from ear to ear. "You can't leave," she said softly. "No one does." Mark fumbled with his seatbelt, his fingers shaking. He scrambled out of the car and ran into the woods, his legs pumping wildly. The trees closed in around him, the darkness oppressive. He didn't look back, too afraid of what he might see. Finally, he stopped, leaning against a tree to catch his breath. The silence was deafening. He strained his ears, but there were no sounds of pursuit. Maybe he'd escaped. Then, a voice came from the shadows, soft and mocking. "You can't run forever." Mark spun around, his back pressed against the tree. The woman emerged from the darkness, her body moving in jerky, unnatural steps. Behind her, other figures appeared, silent, grinning, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Mark's scream echoed through the woods, swallowed by the night. The next morning, a passing trucker found Mark's car abandoned on the side of the road. The driver's seat was empty, the engine still warm. There was no sign of Mark, just a message scratched into the hood of the car. "They're waiting for you." The desolate stretch of Highway 33 was known for its emptiness, an expanse of asphalt cutting through a wasteland of flat plains and endless sky. Alicia was driving home late after visiting her parents, the radio humming faintly in the background. Her headlights pierced the inky darkness ahead, illuminating nothing but the road and occasional flickers of distant shrubs. She was exhausted, her eyelids heavy. The monotony of the road made it worse. To shake the drowsiness, she reached for her water bottle and glanced at the digital clock on her dashboard. 1:14 a.m. Suddenly, something darted across the road. A quick, pale blur. Alicia slammed on the brakes, her car screeching to a halt. Her heart raced as she stared into the empty night. There was nothing in front of her, no movement, no sign of what had just crossed her path. Taking a shaky breath, she muttered, "Get it together, Alicia," and resumed driving. A few miles later, she saw it again. This time it was standing on the shoulder of the road, a figure, unnaturally tall and gaunt, with a face pale as bone. It had no discernible features, just an unsettling blankness where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Alicia gripped the wheel tighter, her palms slick with sweat. She sped up, her tires kicking up small clouds of dust. The figure didn't move, but seemed to follow her with its faceless gaze. The road felt different now. The once familiar highway seemed endless, and the reflective markers that guided her path became sparse, as though the road itself were vanishing. Her GPS flickered before going black, leaving her with nothing but the oppressive darkness and the hum of her car. She was about to pull over and collect herself when she saw something up ahead. A red glow illuminated the horizon. As she approached, the glow resolved into taillights from a parked vehicle, an old, rusted pickup truck. The truck was stopped in the middle of the road, its hazard lights flashing erratically. Alicia slowed her car to a crawl. She rolled down her window slightly, the cool night air chilling her skin. "Hello?" she called out hesitantly. No response. The truck's driver's side door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Her instincts screamed at her to drive away, but her curiosity overpowered her fear. She pulled over and turned on her hazard lights. Grabbing her phone, she stepped out, her shoes crunching on the gravel shoulder. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Her voice sounded small against the vast silence of the night. As she edged closer to the truck, she noticed deep gouges in its paint, like something sharp had scraped along the metal. The interior was empty, but the faint smell of decay wafted out, making her stomach turn. A rusty tool lay on the floorboard, dark stains covering its surface. That's when she heard it, a soft, rasping breath behind her. She spun around, her phone's flashlight sweeping across the empty road. There was nothing there. Her heart thundered in her chest as she backed away from the truck, tripping over her feet. Something moved in the periphery of her vision, a shadow that darted impossibly fast across the road. Alicia bolted for her car, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her hands shook as she started the engine. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the truck was gone. Vanished. She pressed the accelerator, her car roaring forward. The road stretched endlessly, her surroundings dissolving into an impenetrable fog. Panic clawed at her. She should have reached the next town by now, but there were no signs, no landmarks. Just the road, and her headlights struggling against the mist. Then, the figure appeared in the middle of the road again. This time, it was closer, its impossibly long limbs sprawled out in unnatural angles. Alicia screamed and swerved, her car skidding off the road and coming to a halt in the dirt. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she checked her mirrors. The figure was gone. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, the screen lighting up with a text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have stopped." Her stomach dropped. She grabbed the phone, her hands trembling as she typed a reply. "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "Look behind you." Tears blurred her vision as she dropped the phone and threw the car into reverse, desperate to escape. The headlights revealed nothing but the road behind her. She shifted gears and floored the gas pedal, her car tearing down the highway. But no matter how far or fast she drove, the figure kept appearing, closer each time. First on the side of the road, then in the rearview mirror, and finally in the seat beside her. It leaned toward her, its faceless head tilting unnaturally. "You should have kept driving," it rasped, its voice like the scrape of metal on bone. Alicia's scream echoed into the night as her car veered off the road, flipping end over end before crashing into the barren landscape. The silence that followed was deafening. When the highway patrol found the wreck hours later, the car was empty. There were no footprints, no signs of a driver, only a single message carved into the dashboard. "Keep driving." The interstate was barren, a ribbon of asphalt stretching endlessly under a moonless sky. Jake had been driving for hours, chasing the faint glow of distant headlights, but they always seemed just out of reach. His GPS had stopped working miles ago, its screen frozen on a map with no roads. The radio played only static, a grating backdrop to the oppressive silence outside. Jake glanced at his gas gauge, nearly empty. He cursed under his breath and scanned the roadside for any sign of a gas station or rest stop, but there was nothing, just the faint silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. Finally, a sign loomed out of the darkness. "Next exit, Whispering Pines, gas, food, lodging." Relief flooded him as he veered off the highway, following the narrow road to a small, dimly lit gas station. The fluorescent lights above the pumps flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Jake pulled up to a pump and stepped out, the cold night air biting at his skin. The station was eerily quiet, its convenience store dark inside. A faded, open 24 hours sign hung crookedly in the window, though it seemed no one had been here for days. Jake swiped his card at the pump, but nothing happened. He tried again, but the screen remained blank. "Great," he muttered, slamming the pump back into its holster. Need some help? The voice made him jump. He spun around to see an old man standing near the store entrance. He wore a grease-stained uniform and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. His eyes were shadowed, but his grin was wide, teeth yellowed and uneven. "Yeah, the pump's not working," Jake said, trying to steady his voice. The man nodded slowly. "You'll have to come inside. Pay up front." Jake hesitated. Something about the man set him on edge, but he needed gas. With a reluctant nod, he followed him into the store. The inside smelled stale, the shelves half empty and covered in dust. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow light. "Just 1 second," the man said, disappearing behind the counter. Jake glanced around. The store felt wrong. The walls were lined with faded photos of smiling customers, but their faces looked off. Their expressions were too wide, their eyes too bright, as if they were forcing their happiness. One photo in particular caught his attention. A group of people standing in front of a car, their smiles unnaturally large. One of them looked like Jake. He blinked, stepping closer. It couldn't be. The photo was old, its edges curling with age, but the man in the picture was unmistakably him, wearing the same jacket he had on now. His stomach twisted. "Got it," the old man said, returning with a key. Jake flinched, stepping away from the photo. The man held out the key, his grin never wavering. "Pump should work now." Jake grabbed the key without a word and rushed outside, his pulse pounding in his ears. He jammed the key into a panel on the pump, and it roared to life. As he filled his tank, he kept glancing back at the store. The old man was standing in the window, watching him. His grin seemed wider now, his head tilting slightly to one side. The pump clicked off, signaling the tank was full. Jake didn't bother returning the key. He jumped into his car and sped out of the lot, the gas station quickly disappearing into the darkness. But as he merged back onto the highway, his unease grew. The road seemed different now, the lanes narrower, the trees closer. His headlights illuminated signs that hadn't been there before. "Turn back. You don't belong here. Too late." Jake's grip tightened on the wheel. The air in the car grew colder, his breath visible in the dim light of the dashboard. He reached for the heat controls, but the knob wouldn't turn. Instead, the radio crackled to life, static filling the cabin. "Jake," a voice whispered through the static. He froze. "Who's there?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, it began to laugh, soft at first, then louder, more menacing. Jake turned the radio off, but the laughter continued, echoing inside the car. The faint glow of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. Relief washed over him. Another car. He tapped his brakes, hoping to flag them down, but as the vehicle drew closer, his relief turned to dread. The headlights weren't from a car. They were too high, too bright. It was the gas station, its lights barreling down the highway, chasing him. "No, no, no," Jake whispered, slamming on the accelerator. The lights grew closer, impossibly fast, until they filled his mirrors, blinding him. The laughter grew deafening, the car shuddering under its force. Then everything went silent. Jake woke up slumped over his steering wheel. His car was parked in front of the gas station. The pumps dark, the store empty. The photos on the walls were gone, replaced by mirrors. In each one, Jake saw himself, but not his reflection. The images moved independently, their grins stretching wider and wider. The old man's voice echoed from somewhere unseen. "Welcome back, Jake? You'll fit right in." And then the mirrors shattered, the darkness swallowing him whole. The rain came down in sheets, blurring the already dimly lit highway. Jenna squinted through the windshield, her wipers struggling to keep up. Her phone sat useless on the passenger seat, its battery long dead. She regretted taking this route, a remote stretch of highway, notorious for bad weather and worse stories. Her gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. Relief washed over her when she spotted a sign ahead. "Gas station, 2 miles." She let out a breath and eased off the gas, steering her car carefully through the downpour. The neon lights of the station soon flickered into view, casting an eerie glow against the rain-slick asphalt. The station was old and decrepit, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a low-budget horror movie. Only one pump seemed operational, and there was no one else in sight. Jenna pulled up and stepped out into the rain, pulling her jacket tight around her. The pump's screen blinked on as she swiped her card, but the digital numbers flickered erratically. A metallic voice crackled from the speaker. "Please see the attendant inside." Jenna hesitated. The station's interior was dimly lit, the windows streaked with grime. But she had no choice. She pushed open the door, a bell jangling above her. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic. The shelves were sparsely stocked, items layered in dust. Behind the counter sat an attendant, his head bowed, a greasy cap shadowing his face. Your pump's not working," Jenna said, her voice shaky in the silence. The man didn't respond. He sat unnervingly still. Jenna took a cautious step closer. "Hello?" He moved suddenly, lifting his head. His face was wrong, his features slightly off, like someone had tried to sculpt a human face and failed. His mouth twisted into a smile that didn't reach his cold, glassy eyes. "Cash only," he said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. Jenna shuddered. "I don't have cash," she replied. The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too small, too numerous. "No cash, no gas." She backed away, her heart pounding. The bell above the door jingled again, and a gust of cold air swept in. Jenna turned sharply, expecting another customer, but the door swung shut on its own. "Fine," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "I'll figure something else out." She stepped outside, the rain feeling heavier now. But her car was gone. Panic surged through her. She spun in place, searching the empty lot, but there was no sign of her vehicle. The only thing left was a pair of dark tire marks leading out into the night. "Where's my car?" she shouted, rushing back to the station. The attendant was gone. The store was darker now, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long, unnatural shadows. Something moved at the edge of her vision. Just a flicker, but enough to send her heart racing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The aisles stretched longer than they should have, the shelves towering impossibly high. Jenna stepped cautiously inside, her shoes squeaking on the tile floor. The faint hum of the lights was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional drip of water from somewhere above. Then she saw it, a figure at the end of the aisle, tall and thin, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It wasn't the attendant, its limbs were too long, its fingers too spindly. Jenna froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure moved, stepping closer with a jerky, inhuman gait. Its face was obscured, but its presence was suffocating. Jenna stumbled backward, knocking over a display of canned goods. The crash echoed through the empty store. She turned and ran, but the door was no longer there. The walls seemed to close in, the shelves warping and twisting as if alive. The lights buzzed louder, the hum growing into a deafening roar. Jenna clamped her hands over her ears, but the noise was inside her head, pressing against her skull. When she looked up, the figure was right in front of her. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth and featureless, save for a single, wide smile that stretched from ear to ear. "You shouldn't have stopped," it whispered, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones. Jenna screamed as the world around her dissolved into darkness. The next morning, a trucker passing by stopped at the gas station, finding it abandoned. The pumps were dry, the store empty. Only a single car sat in the lot, its doors open, the interior soaked with rain. The driver was nowhere to be found. On the counter inside, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were 3 words: "Don't ever stop." The truck's headlights cut through the dense fog blanketing the highway, their glow revealing little more than the next 30 feet of cracked asphalt. Eric gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The late-night drive had turned into a nightmare when his GPS inexplicably rerouted him onto this desolate stretch of road. There were no other cars, no streetlights, just the relentless fog and the faint sound of his tires on the pavement. The radio had been his only company, but it had cut out an hour ago, replaced by static. He had tried turning it off, but even then the faint hum persisted, as if the static had embedded itself in the car. His phone was dead, and the gas gauge crept closer to empty. As Eric rounded a bend, he saw a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. A hitchhiker, their arm raised, thumb extended. Eric's chest tightened. Something about the figure was wrong. Their posture was too rigid, their silhouette blurred by the fog. But the sight of another person, after hours of oppressive loneliness, was enough to make him slow down. The figure stepped forward, illuminated by the truck's headlights. It was a man in his late 30s, his clothes soaked, his face pale and drawn. He carried nothing, no bag, no belongings, just himself and a desperate look in his eyes. Eric rolled down the passenger window slightly. "Need a ride?" The man nodded. "Thank you. My car broke down back there." His voice was strained, each word spoken as though it took immense effort. Eric hesitated but unlocked the door. The man climbed in, water dripping from his clothes onto the seat. He shivered violently, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "You all right?" Eric asked, pulling back onto the road. "Yeah," the man said, though his trembling didn't stop. "Just been out here too long, this road." He stopped abruptly, staring out the windshield as if he'd said too much. "This road what?" Eric prodded. The man shook his head. "It doesn't matter. Just keep driving." Unease coiled in Eric's stomach, but he said nothing more. Minutes passed in silence, the fog outside thickening until the truck seemed to float in an endless gray void. Eric glanced at the man, who was now staring at the radio, the static growing louder. "You hear that?" the man whispered. "Hear what?" "It's just static," Eric replied, though even he wasn't sure anymore. The sound had changed, shifting in tone. Beneath the hiss, faint whispers seemed to ebb and flow, unintelligible but persistent. The man's breathing quickened. "It's them. They know we're here. What are you talking about?" Eric demanded, the tension in his voice rising. The man grabbed his arm, his grip ice cold. "Whatever happens, don't stop. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, don't stop the truck." Eric yanked his arm away, glaring at the man. "You're freaking me out. If this is some kind of joke." A loud thud reverberated through the truck, cutting him off. Something had hit the roof. Hard. Eric slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. The man screamed, "No! Keep going!" But Eric was already opening the door, stepping out into the fog. The air was colder now, biting at his skin. He walked around the truck, searching for the source of the noise. The roof was bare, slick with moisture. Nothing out of place. "Get back in!" the man shouted from inside the cab. "They're here!" Eric turned, but the fog had thickened, swallowing the truck in a dense, swirling cloud. He took a step forward, and his foot hit something soft. He looked down. A shoe. A single mud-streaked sneaker lying in the middle of the road. Next to it, a trail of wet footprints led away into the fog, disappearing into the void. Eric's pulse quickened as a faint sound reached his ears. Laughter. High-pitched, childlike, but distorted like it was coming from an old tape recorder. "Eric," the voice was low, drawn out, and it came from behind him. He spun around, his breath catching. A figure stood there, just on the edge of visibility, its outline wrong, too tall, too thin. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, its limbs hanging limply. Eric stumbled back toward the truck, but the figure didn't follow. Instead, it pointed. Slowly, deliberately. Its arm extended toward the truck, its bony hand trembling. Eric ran. He threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The man was sobbing now, clutching his head. "You stopped. You weren't supposed to stop." Eric ignored him and slammed on the gas. The truck roared forward, tires spinning on the wet road. The static from the radio grew louder, the whispers beneath it becoming distinct words. "Turn back. Join us. Stay." The voice wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from the back seat. Eric glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart plummeting. A face stared back at him, pale, hollow-eyed, and grinning. It didn't belong to the man next to him. It didn't belong to anyone human. The truck veered off the road, crashing into a ditch. When Eric opened his eyes, he was alone. The man, the figure, the truck, everything was gone. He was lying in the middle of the highway, the fog lifting as dawn broke. But he wasn't alone. The trail of footprints stretched out before him, leading away, and faint laughter echoed through the still morning air. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a black ribbon cutting through the empty desert. Sarah kept her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes flicking between the road and her fuel gauge, which hovered just above empty. It was past midnight, and the only light came from her car's high beams, which barely managed to pierce the oppressive darkness surrounding her. She hadn't passed another car in over an hour, and her phone had no signal. Just as panic began to creep in, a neon glow appeared on the horizon. A gas station. Relief flooded her as she pulled into the lot, her tires crunching on the gravel. The station looked old, as if it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. A single pump stood under a flickering light, and the building itself was dimly lit from within. Sarah stepped out of her car, the air unnaturally still. She couldn't even hear crickets. The silence pressed against her ears. As she approached the pump, she realized there was no card reader. A small sign taped to the side read, "Pay inside." Sighing, she walked toward the station. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, and the smell of stale air and grease hit her immediately. Behind the counter stood a man in a tattered uniform, his face partially obscured by shadows. He didn't greet her. "Hi," Sarah said, trying to sound casual. "I need 20 on pump 1. The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. His eyes didn't meet hers. "Hello?" She tried again, her voice faltering. Finally, he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." Sarah blinked. "Excuse me?" The man's voice was low and raspy, like dry leaves brushing against each other. "This road, this place, you need to leave. Now." Her stomach tightened. I just need gas." He slowly turned his head toward her, and she saw his eyes, cloudy, unfocused, as though he wasn't really looking at her, but through her. "You can't leave once you've seen it," he said, his lips barely moving. "What are you talking about?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising. A loud thump from outside made her jump. She spun around, peering out the grimy windows, but the lot was empty. The pump's light flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the gravel. "You should go," the man whispered, "but it won't let you." Sarah turned back to him, her pulse pounding in her ears. "What won't let me?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached under the counter and placed a rusted key in front of her. "If you hear it, don't open the door. Don't look at it." "What are you?" Before she could finish, the lights in the station went out, plunging the room into darkness. The faint hum of electricity died, replaced by a low guttural growl that reverberated through the air. Sarah's breath hitched as the sound grew louder. Circling the building, the man grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Take the key," he hissed. "It's your only chance." Another thump shook the walls, and Sarah's fight-or-flight instinct kicked in. She snatched the key and bolted for the door, ignoring the man's protests. The growling followed her, growing deeper, closer. She threw herself into the car, slamming the door shut. The engine sputtered, refusing to start. Come on," she muttered, her hands trembling on the key. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A shadow, impossibly tall and thin, slid across the side of the building. It moved unnaturally, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice. The growling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a sharp knock on her window. Her head whipped toward the sound, but nothing was there. Just the empty lot, bathed in the sickly glow of the flickering light. Another knock came, this time from the passenger side. She refused to look, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. "Sarah," a voice whispered, soft and melodic. It came from the back seat. She couldn't breathe. She didn't want to turn around, but the instinct to check was overwhelming. Slowly, she tilted her head, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. A face stared back at her, pale and featureless, except for a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. Its teeth were jagged, too large for its mouth, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were nothing but deep, empty sockets. "Drive," it said, the word dripping with malice. Sarah screamed, twisting the key in the ignition. This time, the engine roared to life. She slammed her foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car tore out of the lot. The shadow followed her, keeping pace with the vehicle no matter how fast she went. Its grin widened, stretching impossibly far as it tapped on her window, its laughter echoing in her ears. She drove until the sun began to rise, the shadow finally fading into the daylight. By the time she found another gas station, she was shaking so badly she could barely hold the pump. When she told the attendant what had happened, his face went pale. "You came from that road?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "You're lucky you made it out," he said quietly. "Most don't." From that day on, Sarah never drove at night again. But sometimes when she's alone, she still hears the tapping on her window and the faint, mocking laughter.